Welcome to another episode of Purpose Today. I'm your host, Dr. April Dobson, and I'm very excited to have a special guest on the show today, Ted Neal. Ted is a published author. He is a global healthcare advocate and has authored numerous books, and I'm very excited to have him on the show. He's also a keynote speaker. Don't go anywhere for this exciting episode of Purpose Today, where we're talking about solving problems with purpose, protecting with love. And this is in a brand new series of Purpose Today, where we are focusing on purpose-driven problem solving. So don't go anywhere. We'll be back right after these sponsor messages. Purpose Today is brought to you by Purpose Today Global in partnership with the Purpose Professionals community. The Purpose Professionals community has relocated to our new location. And if you're interested in information on the Purpose Professionals community that exists to help professionals to network with like-minded individuals, pivot to align with their purpose, and grow professionally, type Purpose Professional in the chat. Welcome back to Purpose Today. I'm very excited to introduce our very special guest, Ted Neal. Ted, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, April.
You're very welcome. And I know that I shared a little bit about you earlier, but I know that there might be guests who are watching who would love to have additional insight about who you are. So can you share whatever you would like to share about yourself with our viewers?
Yeah, happy to. Well, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. metro area. As a kid, lived in Northern Virginia, moved to D.C. for undergrad. I always wanted to be a writer. I remember being in third grade and coming downstairs to the kitchen table and telling my parents I wanted to be a writer. But I also knew that the writers that I liked did other things. And it took me a while to figure out what those other things would be. But I gravitated towards global health work because it allowed me to see the world and experience different cultures while still being a service. And I think it kind of married together the roles that I saw from both my parents. My mother was a nurse. My dad was a federal judge, but before he married my mom, he was actually a Catholic priest.
Wow.
And so in some ways, I think I followed him more in that role in terms of the care and pastoral aspect than I did, his role as a lawyer. But traveling the world also fed my creative muse, and was constantly writing on the side. And by 2017, I was able to shift to writing full time.
That's wonderful. Well, I know there are a lot of people who are watching who are aspiring authors. And, you even have kids who start writing at a really young age. There may be some viewers who are watching who have children who love writing. So what can you share for parents who are watching or for adults who are watching who have a desire to become an author? What's your advice to them on where they start?
I hesitate because I feel like my answer for parents of children would be very different than for adults. I think for parents of children, I think what you want to do is encourage the writing, encourage that creativity. I talk to so many people as adults who experience some real childhood wounds and a real repression of part of their identity because their parents did not make room for creative pursuits because they didn't see them as practical. That said, creative pursuits, unfortunately, and I think we'll talk about this more later in the podcast, but they don't necessarily pay. And so I think as parents, there's a question of trying to guide that and nurture that creativity. Because if someone has that creative spark, it's part of their soul. And so we don't want to repress it. But we also want to scaffold it and guide young people to get those skills that they can that will allow them to support those creative pursuits. And for adults, I mean, keep at it. I once heard the expression that, the only failure is to stop trying.
Right.
But making that transition to doing it full time and trying to, support yourself with it can be very hard. And don't beat up on yourself if you can't, because I mean, James Joyce couldn't make a living writing just on his own. He had to teach as well. And so if he can't do it, don't expect that we can either. So be gentle with yourself in that respect.
I think you have some very interesting points that you made, and I definitely, agree, to ensure that we're continuing to fuel our creativity. I think we all were born with creativity, and I think finding ways to utilize the creativity, I think is great. I think if we put ourselves in a box and only look at what we believe is the potential for an income, I think we could miss out, on a wonderful opportunity. So it's about being more creative. It's about, I think we can talk to people who have been successful, right, with what they desire to do. I know there are a lot of opportunities for writing that people would really be surprised about, like writing opportunities that make over 6 figures. So I think it's really just about finding out more information. So I do appreciate you really encouraging everyone to fuel the creativity. So that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I know you mentioned also in your introduction about how you ended up on the path, towards global health and the doors that it opened for you. So I do believe it's important for us to identify ways that we can solve problems. And I think solving problems should be, not just in our homes, not just in our communities, but I think that we can find, ways that we can solve problems around the world if we're able to think outside the box. So can you share, with us, because I know you've made some significant effort with solving problems, but if you can share insight on your first significant efforts that you made to solve problems in your community or, around the world, and what inspired you to do so?
I was drawn to public health, partly because, it is all about problem solving, usually in low cost, common sense, community-based ways. And I love that about public health. Public health is about prevention. And, isn't it great if we can prevent these things from becoming big issues when we need much more acute treatment, which is more expensive and harder to sustain. And I think that's what I liked about public health work. You find a problem, determine underlying factors, and then work to resolve them. And you're never working in isolation. You're always working with others. And again, being an introvert and being a writer, I like the fact that that type of work brought me out of myself, encountering, connecting with other people. My writing as a way to solve problems is much more personal, and it's usually a reaction to some injustice that I perceive. It could be the experience of kids who are orphaned, who have HIV/AIDS, and then their ongoing abuse at the hands of their caregivers, which led to 2 memoirs of mine. It could be the simple fact that kids with disabilities don't have enough books where they can see themselves as heroes, which my friend who's a disability advocate pointed out to me. So we wrote that series of books. Or it could be that my friends and loved ones, who are people of color, and their families, their children, are not as safe in this country as someone with my background. And so my book series on racial justice is partly an effort to make a better, safer world for them, but also selfishly for me, because my friends, they carry a part of my heart with them. And if something happened to them, it would be unbearable to me. So I think there's I'm serving 2 things, feeling like I'm a service to my community, my loved ones, but also protecting myself and protecting my loved ones.
So, there's a lot of things that we could unpack, right, with what you said. And so I think I just want to rewind a little bit, because you use some very, very specific examples. You used an example. You shared about, protecting children who are abused by their caregivers, protecting orphans. Was there something that you experienced specifically? Because I feel like the audience is probably wondering, there's a gap here somewhere. So can you help us to close that gap? What was your experience with those observations?
I think if we really go back to like why I was doing this, I think my heart was opened up to it because when I was about 3, my mom had breast cancer, and that was a very formative experience for me. She survived, praise the Lord.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful for it. And I'm proud of the fight that she, that she went through to survive, and dedicated her life and career afterwards to working with breast cancer and breast cancer survivors. So again, an amazing model for me. But I think that fear of losing a caregiver, that vulnerability I felt at 3, it ingrained itself into me. And even in college, I found myself volunteering at a homeless shelter for kids with HIV/AIDS in Washington, D.C. And just something about it clicked. And I really do think it's because I had that empathy for kids who had lost caregivers or who had been separated from caregivers. And in a way, working with them, as we always say, I was actually healing a part of myself. So I think that that led me to working with vulnerable children. I think going on that background, I think I've forgotten the other part of your question, so maybe you could repeat it for me.
Well, I just felt like there was a gap, right? So you mentioned very specific things, right, when you were giving the example, and you mentioned children who are abused by their caregivers. You mentioned orphans who have HIV and AIDS, and so those were very specific examples. So I feel like the audience might be wondering, okay, where's the gap? What did I miss? Like they're missing, an element, they're missing something. And I was just asking if you could, maybe shed a little bit of light of, are those specific examples that you experienced, and if you can just share some insight on that to close any gaps that the audience might have.
Sure. Well, after I graduated from college, I originally thought I'd go into journalism, and I was drawn to covering stories that were affecting people on the margins and children. And I was doing a lot of work around sex trafficking in Washington, D.C., and how HIV was affecting that, and how people were trying to help sex workers, but there was some controversy around that. But as I got more into covering HIV/AIDS, I realized I needed to, if I really wanted to understand it, I needed to go to sub-Saharan Africa. And there was a Jesuit priest from Georgetown, where I did my undergrad, who had founded an orphanage for kids with HIV/AIDS in Kenya. So I moved there and lived there for 2 years. And that was really how I got my start in public health. And at the time, I realized, being a journalist about this is too abstract. I couldn't maintain my objectivity. So I kind of threw myself into that work. And that's where the shift into public health really happened. And of course, living at this orphanage for kids with HIV/AIDS was a huge formative experience for me. And I ended up writing a memoir about it. And then 20 years later, I I kept in touch with all those children, the children who survived and grew up into young adults. And 20 years later, they circled back to me and said, "Hey, Ted, after you left, we experienced 2 decades of sexual abuse at the hands of staff, at the hands of members of the Catholic Church." And so I ended up writing a follow-up memoir that I didn't expect to write, but was really about the journey of getting their stories, coming alongside them, trying to seek justice for what had happened to them. And there was a lot of resistance to it. And even in the post-Me Too era, there was a lot of attacking the survivors and their credibility. And I had to confront my own naivete that people would be interested in such a story and that people would jump to the help of these children. They didn't, and we really had to fight. So those are the 2 very specific examples I was referring to.
I know that there had to be a degree of challenge, and you did say that you faced some resistance, with that. What was it that really propelled you forward, even with all of the opposition that you faced in hearing their story? What was it that made you find a way against all the resistance, against all the odds, to ensure that not only were they heard, but that something was done about what had been such a long, ongoing issue?
There's nothing short of righteous indignation. One of the things that really gets under my skin more than anything else is the misuse and abuse of virtue as a shield to protect people doing terrible things. And what I saw in this case were people who had been entrusted to protect these children, had abused these children, and then hid behind their religiosity, hidden behind their pseudo-celebrity for being do-gooders, and justified it, gaslit the children. And I just knew how wrong it was. And there were times where I thought I was going crazy, because I would present this information to the board of directors here in the US of the organization. And this has been a charity that was around for 30 years.
Right.
And they're just defensive, they're in denial, or they're indifferent. And there were times I'm like, am I the crazy one here? Maybe I'm overreacting. But all I had to do was look at the testimonies I was collecting, and just know that this was wrong.
Yeah.
And when you do that, there's usually a particular story that stands out for you. And there was one particular story of the over the dozens of victims. One particular story of a girl who had been sexually abused when she was young. It had been covered up, and she had been sexually abused by a volunteer at the orphanage. She had grown up, and then when she was in her early 20s and she was living at a home sponsored by the orphanage for kids who are young people who are transitioning out of it, she was exhibiting some of the promiscuity you would see from a young woman who had been sexually abused. And instead of helping her, they punished her, and they sent her away to live with extended family who abused her, and took her antiretroviral medications away from her, kept her locked in a hut away from the rest of the people in her extended family, and wouldn't let her care for her child. And she came back to the orphanage, and saying, if I go back, I'll die. And they sent her back. And it was the nuns at the orphanage that sent her back. and she ended up dying alone in a shack. And her son was lost to follow-up. That was the story that galvanized me. That was I couldn't let that go. And there were plenty of stories, but it was that one I couldn't let go. And whenever I started doubting myself, I would just think of Christine and think of how she died and think of how wrong that was. And even though it isolated me, even though I lost friends, I lost colleagues on the board because of it, I couldn't let Christine go.
So how did you, and for those who are watching, I know that this is a very emotional topic. This is a very sensitive topic. And if there are any resources that you have for people who might be facing these types of situations, I would invite you to put that in the chat. But how did you finally break through for someone to listen? And what was the final outcome? I know it's important to make sure that we take a stand for what's right. We take a stand to ensure that people who are facing similar situations, that they're taken out of those situations, and that that it's stopped, so that we don't have more Christinas, right? So what were you able to finally do? What was the final outcome, and what was the breaking point that you finally had the right people or organizations to listen?
A long time. And it was, in some respects, a combination of playing different organizations, different institutions off each other, and also removing options for the people who, like the board of directors, removing their options until they had no other choice. One of the first places I went to was the Washington Post, because this organization was, the board of directors was based in DC, had a lot of connections to Congress, and was also supported by USAID. And I thought this would be a great story for the Post. And when I approached the Post editors, one of the first things they said was, "This is a very valuable and valid story, but we don't have the bandwidth to cover it." I reached out to the Nairobi bureau chief of the Washington Post, and he said, "We are interested." And he spoke to his Kenyan reporter, Rael Ambur, and she had grown up in Kenya. She knew about this organization, and this organization was huge in Kenya. It was famous. And she said, "I'm not taking them on. They are too well connected." This is a Kenyan woman who had bravely written stories exposing scandals in the Kenyan military, and she was not going to take on Nyumbani Children's Home. But I kept sending them information. I as much as I could, even as the board of directors was canceling my email, sending me letters from the lawyers to cease and desist. And because they were receiving money from USAID, I reported them to USAID, and they finally acted. And because it was an organization that was receiving US taxpayer money, USAID called in the Office of the Investigator General, which are federal agents. And even though this was taking place overseas, they sent these federal agents to start investigating. And once that happened, the board of directors had bigger problems than me, because the federal agents immediately started uncovering that everything I was alleging was true, and worse. And then once that happened, the Washington Post and my Kenyan counterpart, Rael, then she was ready to take on the case. And I understand why she was afraid to take on the case. And the organization is connected to a lot of politicians, Kenyan politicians, and journalists sometimes go and get disappeared when they uncover the wrong things. And once the FBI started investigating the story, there was a paper trail. And then that was when Rael was like, "Oh, I'll take this on now." And so we worked for almost 3 years together to uncover it, and get the story out there. And with that pressure of public exposure, with federal agents coming in, and then also I was trying to exhaust every option of sending information to Kenyan authorities, which were underfunded and understaffed. I was even, the organization, the 501c3 was incorporated in actually New York State. So I reached out to the Attorney General of New York State and their charities division and sent them all the information. I reached out to people in Congress who had supported the organization and their aides and said, hey, this is what's happening. So just tried making it impossible for the board to do anything but choose full disclosure. Eventually, after they had no other options, they were forced to. And eventually, after 3 years of this, they finally did the things that I recommended in the very beginning. And they stripped their support for the orphanage itself. And they took all their money and all the resources they had and just focused it directly on the survivors, on the alums of the orphanage, and supporting them, and stripped out the middle management that had kind of metastasized and had been basically exploiting the children for their, perpetuating themselves. And some of these children weren't even children anymore. There are some who are almost 40 years old, but the board of directors did not have a relationship with them, and they still thought of them as children. And one of the things I was encouraged, like, no, you need to meet them. You need to know their names. I did, because I lived there. So that's happening now. And I'm glad to say that the board, like I said, has devoted all their resources to doing right by those kids and young adults. It just took doing all the wrong things or taking away the other options from them first.
Yeah. And I know that was something that you had to be consistent and resilient with working through. And I'm sure that, everyone, who was impacted, that they were grateful that you actually were the person to take a stand. I know that
be surprised. You'd be surprised. Sometimes for doing your job, people are not grateful. And, even some of the young people who were affected, the young adults, they didn't know the extent of the abuse. So all they saw was, oh my gosh, Ted's going after the only home I've ever known. He's going after people I trusted. So even among them, until the full truth came out, there was resistance. So I interrupted just to point out for any other whistleblowers out there, you sometimes will encounter resistance from the people you thought would be your allies, but you have to keep pushing.
Yeah. Well, it's evident that a lot of the things that you did, and I was going to ask one question, but I'm pivoting to something else, because I believe the resilience that you displayed really showed that you needed to not only ensure that there was justice, but it really aligned with your core purpose. And so how do you believe purpose should impact the decisions that we make in life, and what role do you believe purpose has in our lives?
Yeah, and it's such a great question. I know, so integral to your the theme of your podcast. I'm definitely a big believer in the work of Viktor Frankl. And he was the one who said, life doesn't owe us happiness, it owes us purpose. And I think that's another way of saying is happy is not promised in this life. And neither is purpose, but it's purpose we need to seek. And we through our own work, I think we need to find it and define it for ourselves. And happiness is a byproduct of that. And as for alignment with that purpose, I think if we're healthy, and that's not always a given, I think, that's why we have friends, we have community and mentors to check in on us. But if we're healthy and we're doing our work, we can over time develop that purpose and even a conscience, an inner sense if we're on the right track. And if we're growing in emotional, spiritual maturity, that sense comes. Chronological age is no proxy for that maturity and for that clarity. I think once we develop that inner sense, we know. I knew an addict in recovery who had a tattoo on the inside of his wrist that said, "You know." It is a message just for him that he did have a developed sense of right and wrong, and he needed to listen to it. He needed to trust himself. And for his journey, a lot of his drug abuse had been drowning that voice out. And so recovery and sobriety for him meant learning to listen to that voice. Sometimes it told him to do things that were actually harder than the alternative. But he knew down that path was the right thing to do, was the esteemable thing to do. And that's how he kind of rebuilt his self-esteem. And I think that's true for all of us. I think we build our self-esteem from doing esteemable things. And I think those esteemable things get their weight from our purpose.
You know, you've said a lot of great things that we could unpack, but I'm just going to go to one of them. And one of the things that you said, you know, you talked about, you know, once we find our purpose, that can bring us happiness. And I think aligning with our purpose brings a degree of joy, right? And contentment when we're aligned with purpose. And you talked about, you know, spirituality and the importance of spirituality. And, you know, I strongly believe that, you know, we are able to have clarity on our purpose and know our purpose, you know, through God. Our creator created us, so he knows why we're here. He knows why he put us here. And so I think it's important for us to ensure that we're not ignoring the purpose. And you're right, a lot of people don't discover it. But I think it's important that we make it our intent, you know, to know and discover our purpose. And we do that by going to our creator. So I could ask you a lot of questions from what you just said. But I want to ask really about your experience, you know, because you had a lot of different points in your career. You had some time in journalism. You did a lot of volunteer efforts internationally. And, you know, there's so many different things that you've done. As you navigated through life and at different points, did you see distinct differences as you moved closer to your purpose and as you aligned with your purpose in your life? As you reflect on things, did you see a visible change?
I don't want to sound like I'm contradicting what I just said, because there's nuances here. And I'm really not contradicting it. But what I think a lesson I learned was that I said, you know, happiness can come from purpose, and that sense of alignment can come from purpose. I don't know if I ever saw a change. I think I just saw a greater and greater clarity of my purpose. What I think was sometimes the tough lesson of that was that I can be aligned in my purpose, but I can still suffer. And I can be aligned in my purpose and not be happy, but I'll still do it willingly because my purpose is actually more important. And I think that's when it really, I mean, that's when the rubber hits the road. If like we are really firm in our purpose and we are committed to it, we're willing to sacrifice our comfort, our happiness, and even our lives, and knowing that we're still doing the right thing. And we, you know, we all have to strike that balance. You know, if I mean, I would have, it's hard to say because it's a counterfactual, but, you know, I'd have to ask myself, would I have died for my purpose? And I like to say I would have. Now, if I had a family, you know, kids, my own kids relying on me, I might have to make a different calculus because they might, and I might have to stop short of, you know, making, you know, that ultimate sacrifice. But I think that is what I've come to realize is, there's a lot I can endure if I'm aligned with my purpose. And that's another thing Viktor Frankl said. You know, when I was working for World Vision, at one point they wanted to send me to Afghanistan to do work for developing preschools, and I said yes, and I went. And you know, one of the things I asked myself was, you know, do I really believe in what I'm doing? And I did. And again, it comes back to doing the esteemable thing. Sometimes the esteemable thing is the hard thing.
Right.
So I think that's one of the things that I've seen change in me.
That's good.
And that I think, and that's the benefit of being able to find our purpose.
I agree.
The other things can kind of fade in importance, and that clarity becomes a real gift.
I agree.
Even if we're going to get buffeted by a lot of resistance for it, but then we can be resilient through a lot of things.
Absolutely. You know, I feel like we could probably keep talking all day, but I want to talk about your books, if you can share with our audience. I know you mentioned a few of your books at the beginning. If there's any book in particular that you want to highlight, and how viewers can find your books if they're interested in purchasing them.
Gosh, I'm so glad you didn't ask me to choose my favorite book. I can't choose my favorite child. Yeah, I counted last night. I'm actually pushing 40 books that I've authored. I think some of the, you know, of course, you know, my books on the investigation related to the children. It's called 20 Years of Unraveling. And it is a follow-up to 2 Years of Wonder, which was the first memoir I wrote about my 2 years living at the orphanage. And I feel an obligation to always talk about those books and try to get them out there. I have a lot of other books too, though. I've written a lot of fiction for middle grade readers, young adults, and adults. And, you know, all my fiction usually has some tie into social justice, some aspect of trying to reflect the experience of misfits and outcasts, as I've had critics describe my writing. And I'll embrace that. I write about misfits and outcasts. I've felt like a misfit and outcast myself. And I think at some point we all feel that way. But I think one of the series that I really have love to talk about is my middle grade series called Mystery Force. And that was a series that I developed with the help of an amazing illustrator named Susie Spooner, and input from my friends in the disability community. And that series really came about because my friend Macy, who's a social worker and uses a motorized wheelchair and has a canine companion, she pulled me aside and said, Ted, there's not enough stories that for kids with disabilities where they can see themselves as heroes. And, you know, I'm a big believer in if young readers can see themselves represented, they can imagine themselves participating in society. And that's so important. And like I mentioned earlier, to me, that I saw that as a small injustice that needed to be corrected. And so I worked with Macy and her connections to the disability community. I worked with Susie Spooner, who was an amazing artist. And we published these 9 books. And as an independently published author, you know, I had to put all the investment into this. And let me tell you, books with illustrations for kids cost a lot more to produce than just regular text. And I don't know if I'll ever break even on these books, but I don't care. I just love that they, the reaction that kids have to them, kids with disabilities and kids without. And also the feedback we get from adults who are disabled, who say things like, I wish we had books like this when I was growing up. I can't imagine how my life would have been different. Or they say things like, I love the fact that these kids with disabilities are happy. You didn't spend the first 2 chapters talking about how alone and isolated they are. So that is a series, Mystery Force. If you know, you want to, if you've got young readers in your life or young at heart readers in your life, check those out. And I have other books that you can see on Amazon, fantasy, science fiction, that you might want to, listeners might want to check out too. But I'll stop there because, as I said, there's like 40 of them, and I could go on way too long.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I know we have your website on the screen. I know you said some of your books are on Amazon. We have your website on the screen that viewers can go to see the information. And we also have your YouTube channels. Do you want to give some insight on the type of content that viewers can expect to see on the two different YouTube channels that you have, just to give some awareness to viewers if you have time?
I've got one channel that's been established for some time, which you can listen to a lot of my audiobooks for free, because I wanted to make them available to as many people as possible. Another YouTube channel I've just started called Moving the Needle for Change is really focused on issues of masculinity. And this has kind of grown out of some of my own observations that we have done a really good job articulating the problems with toxic masculinity. I don't know if we've done a great job articulating the alternative to it. And I think we've ceded that space to a lot of toxic influencers in the so-called manosphere. And if the manosphere is an area where men go to search for meaning, search for purpose, try to make sense of the world, and learn how to be better men, then I want better voices in there that aren't toxic, that aren't misogynistic. And so that's what this channel, Moving the Needle for Change, will be about. So if any of your, and it's not just for men, it's for women too, or mothers or sisters who want to listen to, be part of discussion about what masculinity can be. And I call it Moving the Needle for Change because something I've discussed in my work around racial justice is sustainable change moves in small increments, not through broad moves or broad sweeps of that needle. I think those broad sweeps were just kind of fads. But the real work, the sustainable change, takes place with moving the needle by degrees, with the work every day, every minute, every step we try to take, and towards, in this case, a better masculinity, but more in general, a better world.
Thank you. You've shared so much today, and I hope it's inspired leaders around the world who are viewing. So take action. You just said that, change often happens in small increments. And so, we have to be consistent with efforts that will help to bring change in our communities around the world. Now, there's one other thing that I want to ask you about before we go, because you said at the offset, you talked a little bit about your experience when you were 3, when your mom had cancer, and I'm so glad that she fully recovered. But is there anything that you want to share to people who might be caregivers? And, if at some point in their life, they have to be a caregiver, because that's another way that we can solve problems, right? When there's people in our family or people in our communities who need help, right? Any insight that you can give in that regard?
That's a great question, April. Thanks for asking it. Two caregivers, and I'm in that position right now, as my parents are aging and they're both in their 80s. I'm taking on that role of adult caregiver for them. And I'd say, don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't let your pride or your shame get in the way of that, because it's not about you, it's about them. And so if there's a way you can better support yourself to better support them, that's what's important. The other is a little bit deeper, and that is to work through your resentments. Learn to recognize your part in those resentments, whether you are a parent, whether you are a child caring for parents, or whatever the situation. There's times we're human. We're going to get resentful of those we have to take care of. I have a lot of friends who are in recovery, and I've learned so much from the 12-step community. They have great tools for bringing our resentments to the surface, examining our unfulfilled expectations, and really looking at those expectations and trying to determine if they were ever realistic in the first place, and having compassion for ourselves as we let them go. Because those expectations, some of those cognitive fallacies that we have, some of the unmet needs, say, of our childhood, maybe some of the things that get in the way of us being better caregivers. And those are things we can control. Some of the things with the people we're taking care of, we can't control, but we can try to control and manage ourselves. And so the resentments are part of that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. I know that was very transparent. So I appreciate you for sharing that. And hopefully it was encouraging to people to, ask for help if they need it. And then, for those who are caregivers, I would like to take it a step further, to make sure that they continue to refuel, right? And ensure that they are ensuring that they're engaging in self-care so that they can properly continue to care for others. So I know we've talked about a lot today. Thank you so much, Ted, for being a guest on Purpose Today with Dr. April Dobson. Is there anything else that you want to add for our viewers, maybe that we didn't have an opportunity to touch on today?
Aside from please buy my books and listen to April's amazing podcast, I would say I lament that the path of writing isn't open to more people. I know I'm able to do it because I have privilege. I heard an interview with a journalist recently who admitted he's only able to do his work in investigative journalism because he has money he inherited from his grandfather. And as many artists know, art historically is not paid. Van Gogh experienced this. I mentioned James Joyce couldn't make a living writing. In some senses, letting go of resentments, we have to ask, why should we be any different? But we writers, we artists are lucky because, to the point of your podcast, we often know what we're meant to do. It's create. We can't not create. It's the thing we do even if we weren't paid. And sure enough, frequently we do it and we're not paid. And that's just kind of one of the ways of the world. But I'm sad for the voices we don't hear. So I think just saying to listeners to support art, support journalism. It's so important. Artists and journalists are truth tellers. They tell different types of truths. Artists deal in myths, the things that are made up but universally true. Journalists deal with facts, news, the thing that powerful people don't want you to hear. So we need to hear it. Journalists at their best comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So we need to support them. And I think that's the message I'd want to send out, that I feel that a lot of people need to hear right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And ensure, if you didn't take this away, ensure that your voice is heard. If you're a writer, you're a journalist, any type of creator, ensure that your voice is heard. Dr. Miles Monroe said that one of the wealthiest places on the planet is the graveyard, because people die without publishing books. They die without really doing what they were purposed to do. So I encourage those of you who are watching, be committed, to pursuing your purpose. If you have a desire to write, to be a journalist, to produce songs, whatever it is, do it and use that same creativity that you have to find ways to monetize it. There are so many different experts who are out there who have videos. I'm grateful that today we can use YouTube to receive insight on how to monetize content that you have. There's so many wonderful people, so I won't begin to name names. But thank you again, Ted. If you are looking for Ted's books, they are on his website, tednealauthor.com is his website. And we've got his YouTube channels that are there. And then how do they reach you? If they want to reach you and stay in touch, how do they do that?
I always try my DMs and social media, but one of the best ways is to use the email that you have down at the bottom there. A lot of social media gets clogged with spam and people trying to sell services. So I found that email, as old-fashioned as it is, works pretty well.
Fantastic. So thank you again, Ted, for being a guest on Purpose Today with Dr. April Dobson. It has been certainly a pleasure to have you on the show today, and continued success to you. If anybody put any questions in the chat and we didn't get to those, then please connect with Ted on LinkedIn, shoot him an email, connect with him on IG. And we look forward to seeing you on another episode of Purpose Today. Thank you so much for tuning in. And Ted, I will see you in the back studio here shortly. Thank you so much. And thank you again to all the viewers who are watching today. We certainly appreciate you all. And we're grateful that you had the opportunity to watch. If you weren't able to contact Ted, go ahead and take a screenshot or take a photo so you can reach Ted. Thank you again for viewing. If you're someone who is watching and you feel that it's time for you to pivot professionally, but you're not sure where to start, send us an email. admin@purposetoday.com. Thank you so much for viewing. We look forward to seeing you next time on another episode of Purpose Today. Make it a wonderful, purpose-filled day.